It was 6:48 a.m. on a Wednesday when Ethan Marks unlocked the staff entrance of Mercy Hill Hospital, same as he had done for the past 17 years. The fluorescent hallway lights hummed overhead, casting their usual sterile glow over the white tile floors. He nodded at no one in particular, his ID badge swinging rhythmically against his navy blue scrubs. Ethan's life was as predictable as the weather reports he checked every morning: grey skies, slight chance of surprise, mostly dry. At 42, he had no kids, no contact with his parents, and a divorce that had become more of a footnote than a wound. His apartment was neat but lifeless, his routine clockwork, and his silence rarely broken outside of professional necessity. Was the only place where his existence seemed to carry weight, running CT scans, reading images, logging reports. He was respected, competent, and forgettable all at once. People liked Ethan well enough, but few truly knew him. That morning, the only thing unusual was the man in the corner of the waiting room, older, with a wool coat too heavy for spring, and eyes that tracked everyone like he was watching a silent movie. Ethan noticed him as he passed by with a clipboard in hand. The man didn't look lost or afraid, just like he didn't belong to the pace of the world around him. He would have walked past, as always, but something about the man's stillness pulled at him. It wasn't that he looked sick, he didn't. He looked anchored, like he was waiting for someone who wouldn't come. "Can I help you with something?" Ethan asked, keeping his voice low so as not to draw attention. The old man turned. His face was deeply lined, with snow-white eyebrows and a gentle sharpness in his eyes. "Only if you have a time machine," he said with a soft, sardonic smile. Ethan blinked. It was the kind of answer that didn't ask for a follow-up, but still lingered in the air. "I'm Harold," the man said. "I'm not here for me. I'm waiting for a friend." "All right. Take care," Ethan replied, half turning back toward his route. But as he walked away, something tugged at him, a flicker of recognition that he didn't understand, not of the man himself, but of the feeling he'd seen in Harold's eyes. Later that day, he passed by again. Harold was still there. "Your friend still inside?" "No," Harold said, not looking up from the book in his lap. "He died 2 hours ago." Ethan stopped cold. "I'm sorry." Harold closed the book. "Don't be. He was 88, tired of fighting. I was just here so he wouldn't go alone." There was no bitterness in his voice, just a calm resolve. If loss was something he had made peace with long ago, Ethan didn't know what to say, but his silence felt heard. "I come here sometimes," Harold added, like it needed explaining. "Hospitals are full of truth, you know. People don't pretend here." That was the first of many short conversations. A few days later, Ethan brought Harold a cup of coffee from the staff lounge. The week after, they sat outside the hospital for 5 minutes during Ethan's break, talking about nothing in particular. No one else paid attention. No one knew what was unfolding. What began as small talk between two strangers would quietly evolve into something neither of them expected, something that would eventually challenge the very idea of what family means. But for now, they were just two men, one waiting for nothing, the other perhaps waiting to be found. For the next few weeks, Ethan Marks found himself adjusting his brakes around Harold Whitmore's routine. Not that he'd ever admit it. Harold didn't come every day, but when he did, he always sat in the same place, the bench outside the east wing beneath a crooked birch tree that hadn't bloomed properly in years. Sometimes Ethan would find him reading, other times just watching. People come and go, his eyes absorbing stories that no one else noticed. They didn't speak much, and yet the silence between them had weight, not the awkward kind, but the kind that lets a person breathe without needing to explain themselves. It was the most human contact Ethan had experienced in a long time that didn't require a login or a lab coat. One afternoon, Ethan handed Harold a cup of black coffee. No sugar, no cream, just the way he'd learned Harold liked it. "You remember?" Harold said, mildly surprised. "I've worked in imaging for 17 years, Ethan replied. "Remembering details is kind of the job." Harold gave a small nod. "Most people notice, few retain." There was a pause. "You miss your friend?" Ethan asked. "I do, but I've lost a lot of people." "Comes with the territory," Harold said, sipping. "My wife, my sister, even my college roommate. Outlived them all. I've had time to rehearse. Grief. Ethan looked down at his shoes. I don't talk to anyone in my family anymore, haven't in over a decade. Harold didn't ask why. He just nodded, as if the truth didn't need to be prodded. You married? Harold asked gently. Divorced, Ethan said. Claire and I split 6 years ago, no kids. You wanted them? Ethan hesitated. I did. She didn't. Then I stopped wanting a lot of things. Harold looked at him, not with pity, but with clarity. You know, people talk a lot about second chances. They rarely mention how quiet they look when they arrive. The word stuck. A nurse walked past, waving at Ethan. He waved back automatically, then returned his gaze to Harold, who was adjusting his scarf. You don't come here just for old friends, Ethan said finally. It wasn't a question. Harold smiled faintly. And you don't sit out here just for fresh air. Ethan chuckled. The tension eased. Their connection wasn't dramatic. It wasn't made of grand gestures or tearful confessions. It was built in pieces, in the pauses, the shared coffees, the quiet respect. And while Ethan didn't recognize it yet, Harold saw something clearly. This man wasn't broken, just waiting to matter again. That evening, back in his apartment, Ethan found himself staring at the framed photo of his younger self with his parents, dusty, tucked behind a pile of unopened mail. He didn't touch it, but he didn't look away either. The silence between him and Harold wasn't just comfortable, it was beginning to mean something, and something had started to shift. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Harold didn't show up. Ethan told himself it didn't matter. People had lives. People got busy. Harold was 86, maybe he just needed rest. Still, the bench under the birch tree looked unusually empty. Ethan kept checking it during his breaks, trying not to care, failing at it. By Thursday, he found himself walking to the front desk. Hi, he said to the receptionist awkwardly. That elderly man who visits sometimes, Harold Whitmore. Has he checked in this week? The receptionist looked up. He was admitted on Monday, pneumonia. He's in room 417. Without thinking, Ethan turned and walked. Room 417 was quiet. Harold lay in bed, oxygen tubes gently feeding him air, a book closed on his chest. He looked smaller, like time had compressed him in just a few days. Still, when he opened his eyes and saw Ethan, a smile curled up at the corners of his mouth. You found me, Harold rasped. You didn't exactly leave a note, Ethan replied, pulling up a chair. They sat for a while in silence, like always. You scared me, Ethan said eventually. I know, Harold whispered. I scared myself. Later that evening, after the nurse checked vitals and dimmed the lights, Harold turned his head toward Ethan, eyes clearer than they'd been all day. I want to ask you something, he said. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Okay. I want to adopt you. The words fell into the room like glass. Ethan blinked. What? I want to make it legal. On paper. You'd be my son. Ethan stared at him, stunned. He let out a dry laugh, not from amusement but confusion. You're serious? As serious as I've ever been, Harold replied. Look, I know it sounds crazy, but I don't have anyone, no kids, no living family. Everything I've built, saved, written, it's floating in the air, waiting to vanish. I don't need your money, Ethan said quickly. It's not about money, Harold said. It's about legacy, about leaving this world having chosen someone. You've shown up, you've listened. You've sat with me, that's more than blood ever gave me. Ethan rubbed his temples. You're talking about rewriting your whole life for a man you've known for 2 months. No, Harold said, gently. I'm talking about giving meaning to the time I have left. Ethan stood up, pacing. This is insane. Maybe, Harold said. But don't mistake kindness for delusion. I'm not asking for your permission to die. I'm offering you a place in a story you thought had ended. Ethan didn't respond. He just stood there, breathing heavily, heart pounding in his chest. No one had asked to claim him in a long time. No one had offered to make him family. And yet here it was. Not a joke, not a manipulation. A real, raw offer. A proposal without blood. I need time, Ethan said finally, his voice unsteady. Harold smiled. You have it. Ethan Marks didn't sleep much that night, or the night after. The idea haunted him, not because it was absurd, but because it wasn't. A man he barely knew had offered him something his own parents never truly gave, a place to belong. And it wasn't tied to obligation, guilt, or childhood wounds. It was a conscious choice, but the past doesn't let go just because the present is offering something better. On Saturday morning, Ethan drove for 2 hours to a quiet suburb outside Joliet. He hadn't been there in years, not since his mother's funeral, which he attended out of formality, not grief. The house was still the same, beige siding, peeling porch paint, the swing where he used to sit as a boy creaking in the wind. His father still lived there, or at least that's what he'd heard. They hadn't spoken in 11 years. He stood in front of the door for a long time before knocking. It opened slowly. A man with sunken eyes and thinning grey hair looked back at him for a second. Neither spoke. Ethan, the man said, not warmly, just factually. Hi, Dad. What do you want? Ethan looked down at his hands, then up again. I'm not here for anything, just thought maybe you should know I'm thinking of letting someone adopt me. The man squinted. You're what? His name's Harold. He's 86. No family. He asked if I'd let him adopt me legally. His father let out a bitter scoff. You're joking. I'm not. Jesus, Ethan. You're 42 years old. You need someone to call you son that badly. Ethan felt the familiar sting. Not from the insult itself, but the confirmation that nothing had changed. I needed it when I was 15, Ethan said quietly. But you were too busy pretending I didn't exist unless I disappointed you. His father looked away. You came here for permission or to make a point? Neither, Ethan said. I came to remind myself why the offer matters. He turned without waiting for a reply. Back in Chicago that night, he sat in his dim apartment, holding the adoption paperwork Harold had quietly passed him days earlier. It wasn't long or complicated. Just a few forms, a couple of signatures, and a court appearance. On the last page was a space for the new parent's full name, Harold Whitmore, and below that, new legal adult child, Ethan James Marks. He didn't sign it yet, but he didn't put it away either. He sat there for over an hour just looking at it, not thinking about what he was leaving behind, but what he was finally being invited into. Ethan signed the papers on a rainy Monday morning. No ceremony, no music, no audience. Just the dull click of a ballpoint pen and the sterile silence of the hospital's family conference room, where Harold sat beside him in a charcoal cardigan, smiling as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Feels like I just adopted a grown man with back pain and a caffeine addiction, Harold joked, his eyes shining. Ethan smirked. You're not wrong. They submitted the documents that afternoon. A court date was set for 6 weeks later. Until then, everything remained in limbo, legally unofficial, emotionally undeniable. But word travels fast in places like hospitals, and the questions began almost immediately. You serious? Asked Claire Nolan, his ex-wife, catching him by the vending machines. You're letting some old guy adopt you? Ethan raised an eyebrow. Letting? It was my idea, too. Are you okay? She asked, not cruelly, more confused than anything. I'm better than I've been in years, he said simply. She didn't press further, but her eyes lingered, on him like he was someone she almost recognized, but not quite. Others weren't so subtle. Dr. Romero cornered him in the staff lounge. You understand what this looks like to people? Ethan took a sip of his coffee. A man choosing to give someone else meaning and belonging before he dies? Yeah. Tragic. Romero shook his head. That's not what I meant. You're talking about rewriting identity, adopting a father figure out of the blue. People are going to ask why. People are going to question motives. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Let them. I've wasted too much of my life waiting for people who didn't show up. Harold showed up. I'm not going to question the only thing that finally feels real. Romero went quiet. Meanwhile, Harold continued showing up to the bench under the birch tree, healthier now with a slight limp and a cane that doubled as a conversational prop. He'd wave at nurses like an old regular at a diner. He and Ethan had developed a rhythm. Short talks, shared coffees, longer silences. One afternoon, Harold brought something in a worn envelope. "I found this in my attic," he said, handing it to Ethan. "It's my will, updated. You're listed now." Ethan hesitated. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Harold said. "That's why it matters." In the hallway, two nurses watched them from a distance. "That's the guy adopting the tech, right?" one whispered. "Yeah," the other replied. "Weird, but kind of beautiful." It was spreading now, the idea, the story, the skepticism, the admiration. People didn't know what to call it, so they gave it names. Strange, touching, pathetic, brave. But none of them really mattered, because in a world where people fought for inheritance, names, approval, control, Ethan had been offered something rarer, unconditional acceptance. No one expected it, and few would understand it. But the signatures were real. And the bond quietly was already stronger than most blood. It started with a photo. A young nurse named Talia, new to the hospital and soft-spoken by nature, had taken a picture during one of her night shifts. Harold and Ethan sitting quietly under the birch tree. Ethan had handed Harold a paper cup of coffee, and Harold, cane resting between his knees, was mid-laugh at something Ethan had said. It was a pure moment. Honest, unfiltered. She captioned it. "This man, 42, is being adopted by the 86-year-old. He met at this hospital. Not for money, not for fame, just for connection. Humanity is still alive. Our chosen family. Love without blood." By morning, the photo had been shared 12,000 times. By lunch, it was on the front page of Reddit. By nightfall, local news stations were calling the hospital, and by the next day, Ethan was staring at his own face on a segment titled, "Unlikely Adoption, Chicago Man Finds Family at 42. At first, Ethan wanted to disappear. He hated attention. Hated the idea of people poking into something he still barely understood. 86 years of relative obscurity, he said, sipping tea in his apartment while the news played in the background. "And now I'm trending on Twitter. Should I be worried?" Ethan chuckled. "You always wanted to be remembered." "True. But I imagined it would be for my lectures on post-war sociology, not for adopting a grown man with a coffee addiction." Messages started pouring in. From strangers, mostly. "My dad walked out when I was 10. This gave me hope. I've never met my birth parents. Watching this made me cry. Thank you for reminding the world that family is more than blood." And then came the skeptics. Blog posts, opinion columns, think pieces titled things like, "Is adult adoption just a publicity stunt? What's really behind this viral father-son duo?" Ethan didn't respond to any of it, but Harold had a different approach. He wrote an op-ed for a major Chicago newspaper titled, "Why I Adopted a Grown Man I Wasn't Related to." It opened with, "Because he needed a father." And I still had one left in me. The piece went viral too. Suddenly their story wasn't just a story, it was the story. TV shows wanted interviews. Non-profits reached out. A producer pitched a documentary. But through it all, Harold and Ethan kept their routine. Coffee, short walks, quiet talks. The world buzzed around them, but they stayed grounded in the stillness that had started it all. One day, as they sat under the birch tree, Ethan asked, "Do you regret going public with this?" Harold looked at him, eyes steady. "Only that. It took me 86 years to understand the simplest truth." "What truth?" "That family isn't who shares your name. It's who stays when you're tired, listens when you're quiet, and sees you when the rest of the world looks away." Ethan nodded. He finally understood. Their bond wasn't viral, it was real. The courtroom wasn't grand. It had no sweeping arches, no polished oak benches, no marble statues of justice. Just beige walls, plastic chairs, and a judge named Caroline Hensley, who looked both amused and slightly bewildered as she flipped through the paperwork in front of her. "Let me make sure I understand this," she said, glancing over her reading glasses. "Mr. Harold Whitmore, age 86, is petitioning to adopt Mr. Ethan James Marks, age 42. Is that correct?" Harold leaned forward slightly. "Yes, Your Honor. And this is not for financial purposes." "No, ma'am. Not part of a legal maneuver for immigration, healthcare, or inheritance advantage. No, Ethan added. It's about choosing each other. There were muffled whispers in the back. A couple of journalists had slipped into the room, despite court staff's best efforts to maintain privacy. A documentary crew waited outside, hoping for a soundbite. Ethan hated it, but Harold had insisted, "If we're going to tell the world something real, let them see it through to the end." The judge looked at them both, then at the psychologist's letter in the file, from Dr. Romero, who, after much hesitation, had written a clear statement supporting the emotional validity of the relationship. "I don't get many cases like this," Judge Hensley said, leaning back in her chair. "Most of what I see is pain, fighting, custody battles, abandonment. You'd be surprised how rare it is for someone to say, 'I choose you,' with no strings attached." Harold smiled. "We'd be surprised too." She paused, then nodded. "All right. Based on the documentation, the absence of objections, and the consent of both parties, the court approves the adult adoption." She brought down the gavel with a soft but definitive thud. "Ethan James Marks is hereby legally the son of Harold Franklin Whitmore." It was done. The cameras outside clicked wildly as they stepped out of the building. Reporters shouted questions. Microphones jutted forward. People stared, but Ethan only saw Harold, standing proudly, his cane in one hand, the other resting lightly on Ethan's shoulder. "Feels official now," Harold said. Ethan smirked. "Does that mean I'm grounded if I forget to call you?" Harold laughed, full and free. "Son, I've waited 86 years to be called Dad. You can forget the rest." That night, they had dinner in Harold's apartment. Nothing fancy. Take-out lasagna and store-brand wine. The framed court document sat on the table between them. "You think people will forget about all this eventually?" Ethan asked. "Of course," Harold said, "but not you and not me, and that's what matters." Ethan nodded. The world could call it strange, touching, manipulative, inspiring, but from that day on, one word stuck more than any other: not viral, not adopted. Family. Autumn came early that year. Chicago's streets turned into rivers of red and gold leaves, and the air grew sharper by the week. Ethan noticed Harold slowing down, not drastically but undeniably. A shorter stride, more pauses between words. To a tremor in his left hand that hadn't been there in July, they still met daily. Sometimes at Harold's apartment, sometimes on their usual bench, though they needed to bring a blanket now, and the coffee had to be hotter. One morning, Harold coughed hard and didn't stop for almost a minute. Ethan watched, helpless. The sound wasn't ordinary, it had weight behind it. Depth. "You need to go back to the hospital," Ethan said. Harold waved it off. "It's just a cold." But it wasn't. By early November, he was back in a hospital bed, room 417 again, this time with congestive heart failure and fluid in his lungs. The doctors weren't grim, but they weren't optimistic either. At 86, even small problems carried big consequences. Ethan visited twice a day. He brought books, even though Harold could barely focus on reading. He brought music, even though Harold often fell asleep before the second song. But most of all, he brought presents. "I can't stop time," Ethan said one evening, sitting by the window. "I never expected you to," Harold replied softly. "But you've made it feel slower. That's something." They didn't speak of death directly, but it hung in the air, not as a threat but a shadow they both acknowledged. Ethan started sleeping less, working shorter shifts. He couldn't bear the idea of Harold slipping away when no one was watching. One night, Ethan stood at Harold's bedside, watching his father, his real father, sleep, his chest rising and falling unevenly. The monitor beeped with clinical calmness, indifferent to emotion. Ethan whispered, "I didn't know I needed this until you gave it to me." Harold stirred, barely audible. "That's how you know it was real." For the first time in his adult life, Ethan cried in front of someone, not in frustration, not in loneliness, but in gratitude and fear. Because now he had something to lose. Someone. The weight of time had finally settled in, not as a surprise, but as a reminder that even chosen family doesn't escape the rules of life. But in those final weeks of fall, as the trees stood bare and the skies turned pale, Ethan Didn't run, he stayed, every day, every hour he could, because time was running out, and some goodbyes are too sacred to be missed. It was a quiet Sunday morning. Outside Harold's hospital window, a thin frost clung to the glass. The city was still asleep, wrapped in that strange blue-gray silence that only comes before dawn. Ethan sat by the bed, coffee in hand, eyes red from another sleepless night. He'd been there for hours, not because something had changed but because everything had. Harold hadn't spoken much the day before. His breathing had grown shallow, voice barely a whisper. The nurses said it could be days, maybe less, maybe hours. They said it gently, but Ethan heard the truth beneath their softness. Then, just after sunrise, Harold stirred. "Ethan," he said weakly. Ethan leaned in instantly. "I'm here." Harold's lips curled just barely. "Of course you are." There was a long pause, filled only by the beeping of machines and the slow rhythm of breath. "I don't have much left," Harold said. "You don't have to say anything," Ethan whispered. "I do," Harold insisted, eyes fluttering open. "Because you're the one thing I got right at the end." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tightening. "I never had a real family," Harold continued. "I buried everyone before I figured out how to love them properly. And then you sat next to me one day with that clipboard and that tired face, and you listened. That's all I ever wanted, someone to stay. I didn't know why I kept showing up," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "I just did." "That's love," Harold replied. "Not the loud kind. The kind that stays." Silence. Then Harold looked at him again, eyes more alert than they'd been in days. "You'll carry this, you know, when I go, and it'll hurt. But don't let the pain be the only thing that remains. Let the love stay, too." Ethan nodded, unable to speak. "I'm proud of you," Harold whispered. "More than anyone ever told you. I see the man you are." A tear slipped down Ethan's face. He reached out gently, taking Harold's hand. "I see you too, Dad," Harold smiled. "That's all I ever wanted to hear. Those were the last words Harold Whitmore ever spoke." He passed later that night, peacefully in his sleep, holding the hand of the man who had become his son by choice, not by chance. Ethan didn't scream, didn't collapse. He sat there, still and steady, eyes closed, whispering thank yous into the space between them, and as the machines went silent, he felt something settle in his chest, not emptiness, but weight. The weight of a life that mattered. Of love that came late, but came whole. Of a goodbye that would echo forever. 3 months had passed since Harold's funeral. It had been small, just the way he wanted. No flowers, no slideshow. Just a few chairs under a tree in Lincoln Park, where the breeze whispered through the branches, and people spoke only when they truly had something to say. Ethan didn't speak that day. He couldn't. He just sat with the weight of the moment, one hand clutching Harold's old cane, the other in his coat pocket, tracing the folded paper that had once made them father and son. Now it was winter. Chicago cold in a way that cuts through even the thickest jacket. And yet Ethan felt warmer than he had in years. He had moved, and not far. People who had been cast out by relatives. People aging alone. People building families from scratch like he once had. Claire had stopped by on opening day. So had Dr. Romero. Even Talia, the nurse who'd posted that photo, now volunteered once a week. At 42, Ethan had become something else entirely. Not just a son, not just a survivor, but a bridge between the past that hurt and the future that could still heal. That afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Ethan locked up and stood outside for a moment, looking at the plaque. "Still, feels weird seeing your name next to mine," he murmured. Then he smiled. "But it belongs there," and with that he turned the key, slipped the cane under his arm, and walked home, carrying Harold's name not just on the door, but in every quiet act of kindness that followed. Because in the end, what Harold had given him wasn't just family. It was the courage to give it to others.